Reality has an identity, okay? The identity is that as which something exists, okay? When you say the word reality, you're naming an identity. It is, you're identifying something, this. Since the time of Aristotle, metaphysics has been an ill-defined term. This paper defines it as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality, which couples the two initial ingredients of awareness, perceptual reality, the basis of physics, and cognitive perceptual syntax, a formalization of mind. U is the entire universe of replicable perceptions, or the object-level universe of the first-order language, L. Conversely, L is the comprehensive first-order intension of U, which is dual to its extension, or object universe U. This is an irreducible, mutual recursive definition of L and U. Equation 4. L is a function indexed by L of U, and U is a function indexed by U of L, where f sub L and f sub U are definition functions with their parameters, definientia in parentheses. In other words, the definition of each definiendum, or defined term, L and U, necessarily takes the other term as a definiens, or definitional parameter. This definitional linkage is ontological. It does not say merely that percepts must be perceived and properties substantively instantiated, but that states in U are meaningless without attributes in L, and attributes in L are unassignable without attributive operators in U. L and U cannot be separated, and U is therefore equivalent to a particular LU coupling within the meta-object domain of the set of LU couplings, consisting of all possible couplings of entities from L and U respectively.
So we want to explain how M, L, and U are interdependent and mutually recursively defined, and M is the global identity of reality, and in this global identity of reality, U is the entire universe of replicable perceptions. So it really covers the entirety of the esse-est percipi to the extent that it covers the replicable perception, so the replicable aspect of the esse-est percipi. So we remain in this idea of defining a theoretical scientific language where we cover all the theoretical aspect that can be replicated. And here, U is also defined in an interdependent way as the object-level universe of the first-order language L. And L in that case, since it's the first-order language of the entire universe of replicable perceptions, it corresponds to this language of this idealized physics that we have already introduced as being this first-order language that covers all object-level truth about physical or perceptual reality. And so L is this comprehensive first-order intention of U. It's this idealized physics extended to cover all of the perceptual universe, all of the replicable perceptual universe. So it's dual to the extension of U. And so you can see that these two ingredients, which is on one hand the entire universe, to the extent that we know it through perception, to be perceived, is coupled to this idealized language that comprehensively covers the different attributes, the different statements, the different linguistic structures that is satisfied by this object universe U. So this idealized physics. And so this reflects this idea of recursive definition. And so we have a notation, which is, L is really a function of U. And so you can still identify L within that statement by the fact that the function is L specific. U is a parameter of that function. And in the same way, U is defined relatively as a function of L. And so these two definitions mutually recursively define both L and U as interdependent terms. They are definition functions that define what U and L are, and the differentia in parentheses is what is the parameter on which the function is defined. So L is defined relative to U because L provides the intention for the extension. It provides the category, the relation, the specific law that explain the perception in U. In the same way, U is defined relative to L because U is always perceived. And so it's perceived through a cognition, an information, a recognition that couples both the linguistic element to the instance in U, and so U doesn't exist apart from L. And so they are both defined relative to each other with each other as parameters. So when you want to define each of these terms L and U, to have them as definiendum, you have to use the other as a definitional parameter, as a definiens. And this is ontological. It's part of how these terms and these domains of reality are defined. It doesn't say that percept must be perceived or properties substantively instantiated, which would be to say that there is a broader sense in which object exists, but there can be perceived or not. And so we just reduce our scope to what is perceived. And there's also properties existing regardless of instantiation. So that would be one way to relate the two and saying, in the particular way in which we view reality, these two are interdependent, but we actually state that U and this definitional linkage is ontological, meaning it's part of the being of L and U. It's not a connection of L and U within M, it's really part of the definition of L and U. And so the states in U are meaningless without attributes in L. So you cannot define anything in U without L, because you have to define the attributes of these states in U. And the attributes in L need operators in U. So there's no sense in saying the language L without the instantiation in U, without the existence of the structures of attributive operators in U, without syntactors that become instance in U and that display these attributes. Although U is syntactically embedded in L, L is oriented toward instantiation. There would be no being for L without U, basically. So it's really part of the ontology of what is L. L truly depends on U at the ontological level. So L and U cannot be separate, and U is therefore equivalent to a particular LU coupling within the meta-object domain of the couplings of L and U. And so it means that when we think of U, we really think about LU coupling. We're thinking of attributes in L from, this first-order language to the extent that they are instantiated in a universe of perception. So there's no sense in saying this object in U exists and then we're going to perceive it with a specific L, with a specific perspectival syntax. Rather, U always exists within the meta objects that are couplings of L and U. So U is not separate from L, never. And because of the hierarchy of the syntactic embedment, because the fact that states are meaningless without attribute in L, L sort of distributes in U, and so U is really made up of this LU coupling. So when you pick an instance, you re-pick something that couples to the axiom. So you cannot pick a number and saying, oh, I just picked this number, and now I'm going to describe what it is. You always pick the number with a mathematical language that defines what you're talking about. And it's really what we mean here. Any separation of L and U is sort of virtual or incomplete, but when you're talking about the ontological nature, especially of the ontological nature of the global identity of reality, you couple L and U, and really everything in U, every specific perception, every specific perceived event is always within couplings of L and U because they're always perceived. We're coupling the SES percipi and the cogito ergo sum, so the linguistic aspect, which is the syntactic aspect of cognition, always projects itself within the being. And so what ends up being in you, in the universe, is always something that is tied to specific syntax that allows this being to appear as what? As information, recognition, cognition, perception. So all of the different couplings of syntax and universe that reflect this self-dual tautology, this meta-tautology of having both L and U giving the identity to the event. So we cannot speak of L independently of U because the L syntax, the L predicates, the L structure is designed to be assigned in the universe U, but U is always just a coupling of L and U. So there's a direction of L towards U, and U always takes something of L. And so that's really how we end up really seeing this coupling. You cannot talk about U without L. That's the extent to which both L and U are coupled and are definitionally coupled with these functions. So an irreducible mutual recursive definition of L and U. And this equation, it pushes away materialism, it pushes away dualism, it pushes away some aspect of idealism, because the domain of the ideas, of the categories, and everything is coupled to the universe. So this mathematical formalism of reality, of how the intension and extension appear and are coupled, let us speak about the origin of objects, of syntax, of universe. An object U is within the meta-object domain of these LU coupling. And so then as a conscious being, you can perceive an entity because you just apply the linguistic syntax that is coupled with the object. And so you're able to perceive situations, to evolve within the universe, always manifesting this language and universe coupling. And so it ties together with the experience of cognition perception. It provides a ground to connect the two and to have, these definiendum terms, as well as related functions that reflect how they can be thought of within this MLU coupling. That's how we can interpret L and U within the definition of M as a coupling of L and U, with M as the global identity of reality.
As related entities, L and U comprise a relational identity. M corresponding to a mapping coupling L and U, which equates to a logically idempotent form of model theory, the CTMU, that can not only couple L and U, but can also couple itself to L, U, and the LU coupling, and so on to arbitrarily high order. Where observable states of the perceptual universe U are couplings of attributes from L with values from U, equation 5, M as a mapping coupling L and U equals to M as a mapping coupling L, and the coupling of L and U equals to M as a mapping coupling L, and the domain of LU couplings. Anything not sharing the structure of L is inexpressible in L, and because L amounts to cognitive perceptual syntax and thus limits perception and conceptualization on U, nothing is perceptible or conceivable which is not expressible in L. That is, the perceptual universe U, which coincides with the time-dependent coupling, L coupled to U, and the inclusive meta-object domain of the LU couplings forming the universe of M, the syntactic metaverse, contains nothing which is not in structural correspondence with cognitive perceptual syntax L. U is entirely embedded in L as perceptual content, and secondarily as inferred properties and relationships of perceptual content. The mapping may thus be contracted, retracting U, which is also the coupling of L and U, which is also the syntactic metaverse of the LU couplings entirely into L, and leaving M as an identity that distributes over L.
So we understood the structure of intelligibility as L coupled to U, the language coupled to the universe. And so the language provides all the attributes that the universe can instantiate with attributes that satisfy the predicates of the language. And so we understood the intelligibility as L coupled to U. And what brings the intelligibility is this meta-language M, this relational identity M that couples L and U. But actually, first of all, we identify this identity M with the CTMU, this cognitive theoretic model of the universe. And so this object that is developed by the author in the CTMU, A New Kind of Reality Theory, the 2002 paper, brings a lot of features to this identity, which explains how it can achieve all of the tau properties that we have outlined, how it can distribute, how it can evolve, by cumulative factorization of telesis, because it's made of syntactic operators, and there's a hierarchy of operators and so on, and it all is grounded on this unbound telesis. So there's a ground state, and then there is, the mu form, which is the original start symbol of the theory that distributes over the universe and that is able to launch the potentialization and actualization process from this unbound telesis. It's defined as this asymmetric perturbation of the unbounded lattices. So there's a lot of context on the CTMU that will explain how M satisfies some of the properties that we are describing. The origin, the evolution, how U is getting metrized by L, and so on. This is described in the CTMU. And here we stay at a higher level and we say the important part of this is that M, which will be identified with the CTMU, is a logically idempotent form of modal theory. And so the modal theory that brings, the language, the universe, with the interpretation of those language and universe. So modal theory that brings the intelligibility to the structures is presented as logically idempotent. And so it means that this identity M not only will explain the link from the language to the universe, but it can explain all of the components. It can explain couples itself to L, to U, to the LU coupling. And so we have an internal model of every component of reality. We have arbitrary degrees of explanation. The universe has this arbitrary degree of metacognition, which does not mean that it can think of itself, thinking about itself, and so on for 1,000 times, for billions of times. We're not talking about a tower of metacognition. We're talking about a model that keeps structuring reality at every level and that falls back on itself. So it explains the language, it explains the structure of the universe, it explains when the two are coupled together, it's still something within the structure of intelligibility. And you can express the metacognition of the universe by itself, but it will stay within the flat level of this logically idempotent relational identity, M. And so reality will always model itself at whichever point you take it. So you say, I have a predicate, I have an instance that satisfies a predicate. Well, you can think of the two together. You can think of the coupling. It's still something that is explained in the universe. And if you think of the relationship between the explanation of the coupling and the coupling, it's still explained within the universe because the CTMU, the relational identity M, couples at an arbitrarily high order to itself with logical idempotence, meaning we don't need to add something external to it when we do this process of self-explanation at an arbitrary high level of self-reference. We always fall back to the single idempotent theory. And so the universe, by this structure, can think about itself and can think of itself thinking about itself. So all the objects sort of gathered within this single relational identity M. So where observable states of the perceptual universe U are coupling of attributes from L with values from U, we then have the equation, and it displays this general super applicability of the relational identity M because this LU coupling, we can say it's a coupling from L coupled to U, and then we can jump directly to L coupled to the syntactic metaverse, all of the potential couplings that can be expressed within reality. And the basic idea is that only what is perceptible belongs in reality, shows up in reality, because reality will contain all that explains perception and concepts that are superimposed on top of these perceptions. So in a similar way where Kant was saying that you can only perceive within the universe what is in accord with your own structure of intuition and of understanding. You can only perceive things in time and space. You can only conceive things which are in accord with logic, with the 12 categories of Kant. Here we take a more general point, which is there is cognitive perceptual syntax, and it limits the kind of universe that we can have, because the universe will only show up within this LU coupling, SAS per CP, to be is to be perceived. And here we don't have a limit of the human mind on reality. We can only perceive what our mind allows us to perceive because of its structure. Rather, we took the broader standpoint of reality and say there's a cognitive perceptual syntax within this reality, L. And so this limits perception and conceptualization on the universe U. And so the perceptual universe U, as we've already mentioned, since it needs to be specified by attributes, by predicates, it needs to be coupled with L. And so the perceptual universe U is always a LU coupling. And so here we say it's a time-dependent coupling LU. So it relates to the factorization of telesis at a given time. The universe evolves by refining this LU coupling. So the LU coupling is time-dependent. But we also define the syntactic metaverse, so all possible LU couplings. So it's a meta-object domain. this also has to be in accord with the cognitive perceptual syntax L. And this comes from the fact that any universe is an instance of some language, of some perception. So we have L as this great filter of everything that can exist, of the syntactic metaverse, of all the possible perception that can exist within the universe, all the possible perception and conceptions that can exist. My question here is, are we allowed to define this meta-object domain of the coupling of L and U? That seems to correspond to this unbound telesis. I'm slightly confused because on the left of the equation there's L, and on the right there's like this free LU coupling of the potential LU couplings. And what seems to be primordial in the CTMU is unbound telesis. So telesis is just what factorizes into LU coupling. So it seems like we're extracting L from this unbound telesis and say there is a general limiting cognitive perceptual syntax L that will limit perception and conceptualization on U because it will all be within the domain of the LU couplings. It seems proper to me because U has to have some values that have a structure from L. So there's a dependence, there's a syntactic embedment of U in L. And so I think that's why you can split the two and have on the one hand the object language L and the other the domain of the meta-object of all potential LU couplings. But this is very interesting model of reality that takes reality as a focal point instead of the Western tradition of taking the mind of the subject as a base point and saying L is fixed by the categories that we can deduce, and then the universe doesn't show all of itself within this L. Here we have a much broader formalization of the LU coupling at the level of reality with concept of all possible perception or conceptions within the syntactic metaverse, and the model that can arbitrarily think about itself and model itself. So it's truly a step up from the Western thought that I've studied so far. It is quite unbelievable, actually. And so this embedment of U in L, we describe it as the fact that U is entirely embedded in L as perceptual content, and secondarily as inferred properties and relationships of perceptual content. And here we're saying, when Isaac Newton saw the apple fall from the tree, that's a direct perceptual content. So you need the space-time object syntax, you need the quasi-perceptual syntax, you need the logical mathematics syntax. So you need this human perceptual cognitive syntax to be able to just detect this apple coming down from the tree. And that's just an event that is passed by the cognitive perceptual syntax available by Isaac Newton. But then there's the inferred property. So maybe you see the apple on the floor, and so you infer that it fell from the branch of the tree. So you establish relationships. Maybe it's the season where fruits are ripe, and so you establish a relationship between the weather and the event. Various kind of relationship. In the case of Isaac Newton, the relationship inferred is the theory of gravitation. So the universe, it has attributes, has a color or shape from the cognitive perceptual syntax of the observer. So that's a direct approach. That's a direct observation of phenomena. But then there's all the inferred properties, the architecture of relationships of perceptual content one to the other. And both the syntax of perception and of conception about what is there in U is embedded in L. L defines all of that. L defines this logical mathematical syntax, this quasi-perceptual syntax, this emotetic syntax, this space-time object syntax. L defines all of that, and U then just gets embedded in L, and when you couple the two together, you have a reality where people experience things, understand things, and so on. So the question is, what is reality? Is it cognitive perceptual syntax that takes specific values that are within the range allowed by this cognitive perceptual syntax, within the range of distinctions that this syntax allows? Is it that reality, that plus the inferred properties, relationships, and modeling of all the different relations that occur on top of these perceptual events? And we're saying, yes, that's reality. And so the mapping can be contracted. The universe is SAS per CP, so it's always coupled to a language that defines the universe. And even the syntactic metaverse, which is just all the possible couplings of language and universe, they all have these properties of syntactic embedments. And so they retract into L. And so M when we say that M is a mapping that couples L and U, we can just leave it by saying M distributes over L. And L happens to couple to universe, to metrize the universe. And I think it comes down to this equation 5 here, where the cognitive perceptual syntax of the general model of reality, of the model that is of arbitrarily high order of reality, the cognitive perceptual syntax is coupled to the syntactic metaverse entirely. So the universe in its entirety appears as language universe coupling, and we can even retract the syntactic metaverse into L, the global theoretical language L. And I wonder here if L that we understood as sort of a subset of L that was a theoretical, logically idempotent with respect to explanation, like L explains itself. I wonder if it's not this actually super expensive theoretical language that is coupled to the syntactic metaverse, so to all the possible LU coupling. This kind of language explains itself. And here we're close to the idea of Plato with Plotinus, with the idea of the one, the nous, then the soul, with the soul being an emanation of the nous. And L here, because it embeds the entire syntactic metaverse with all the language universe couplings, can be thought of as this nous, this intellect from which the universe emanates. The soul is the material, sensible world, and that's what instances of the syntactic metaverse are. They are fully instantiated. Well, L is sort of the nous that syntactically embed the world, the universe, material, the sensible. How does M couple to U? It can only do so through L, as far as I understand it. Perhaps it can couple to the general idea of U as instances that will contain the values of L, not fully defined. Overall, I find very compelling this idea of a model theory that is logically idempotent, that can apply to itself to provide intelligibility to itself at any different level. So it can provide self-intelligibility and intelligibility to all of its components. So that's the triadic form of the CTMU. And this L is general cognitive perceptual syntax of reality. That's a model that needs to be extracted from this unbound telesis. So the syntactic metaverse would emerge from this unbound telesis, which factorizes into LU coupling. But unbound telesis would also reflect this L, this cognitive perceptual syntax L, which is sort of the syntactic pre-metaverse. So I find it interesting that you can extract one of the factor of the telesis. You take all the unbound telesis, you extract one factor, just the cognitive perceptual syntax of this telesis, and you refer to it as this L. L as a limit of perception and conceptualization makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's a great generalization of the Western idea of Kant, like the split between the subject that has a cognitive perceptual syntax and the universe, which corresponds to that syntax, but also is a known with the noumena. This is an idea that feels like it was not fully fleshed and that is much more fleshed out here, where we conceive of this link of cognitive perceptual syntax and universe at a ground level. And here's a very powerful ground because it has this logical idempotence. So it's a ground that thinks of itself at all possible levels and thinks of all these components. So you cannot get stuck into these two components are arbitrary because they are unknown and something mysterious couples them. No, the M, the relation identity, self-explains itself because it's logically idempotent, right? So you have the CTMU that just models itself, talks about itself at every level. And here the level is the syntactic metaverse. So it's better than the multiverse. It's all possible language universe couplings. And so M, the CTMU, distributes over L, and that's the general mapping. Because we can retract the universe, the SAS per CP, into the cogito ergo sum, into the cognitive perceptual syntax.
By duality of the syntactic distribution of the meta-language M over its object language L, L retracts into N, so that everything resides in the global identity. Equation 6. M as an identity that distributes over L retracts into M. The global identity which retracts into M prime, which would be the mapping coupling M and the meta-object domain of the LU couplings. That is the syntactic metaverse, which is also M prime prime, which is the mapping that couples M with another meta-object domain. Here of the coupling of M with the LU couplings or syntactic metaverse, and so on by the logical idempotence of M.
So again, M is the single coherent entity, and L is the object language, the first order intention of the universe U. And L is operator quantized. So there's many L operators, and there's one M. And so M meta-surjectively maps onto L. So there's this homological mapping that projects M into the various L quanta, into the L operators. So M distributes over L. And so L ultimately retracts into M, which is the single coherent meta-language that will include this object language. M forms this coherent syntactic unisect of L. It combines all of the L syntax into a unified medium into M. So everything resides in the global identity M. And so we had this idea that M distributing over L was the ultimate form of reality because U is syntactically embedded in L as perceptual content. So that was our starting point. And equation 6 goes further and encodes the fact that this distribution of M into L actually retracts into M. M is the root of the entire deployment of the universe into M, L, and U, into identity, language, and universe. And so M carries the entire identity of the system and the entire linguistic capability and the entire perceptual universe capacity of the system. So the identity M distributing over L retracts into M. And we have then the following expansion of the equation into the logical idempotence of M. So M is its own explanation. M returns itself when it applies to itself. So M is able to model itself. So the identity M can also take the form of something that couples the identity with the syntactic metaverse of all the LU couplings. So all possible state and syntax couplings form this metaverse of every perceptual content that is compatible with a perceptual syntax in L. So you have the entire universe of what can emerge in the course of evolution of the universe, a syntactic metaverse where M could pick ingredients from there and inject it into reality. And from this metaverse, you can actually generate this concrete LU coupling, which becomes the universe and the syntax that encodes the universe. So that's the syntactic metaverse. And this is within the identity M, which provide this meta domain where the two can be coupled. But you can also here talk about the coupling of M with these couplings here. And so it's the self-intelligibility of the system that models its own application to the components generated by the model, factorized into state and syntax. And so we can understand the link between the global identity, which contains all the architecture of reality, all of the toe properties of reality, linked to the telesis that will factorize into the language in the universe. M understands that. It's not reduced to have telesis emerge and then just observe blindly how a specific perception emerged. It can think about itself modeling this coupling and so on. And so this is this metacognition level of the universe, which is able to apply to itself and brings intelligibility at any order, arbitrarily high order of intelligibility within the system. Because the identity M, the CTMU, will capture any level of self-identification. So you also have M prime prime. It's also the same identity. And now it couples the identity with the identity coupled with the LU couplings, with the syntactic and universe couplings. So it's another meta-object domain where instead of just looking at this factorized telesis L and U, now you provide intelligibility to the mapping of the identity to these couplings. And the mapping could be these couplings emerge in the course of the self-identification of M. And so they have this characteristic of being the particular coupling that satisfy the telic principle of the identity M, coupling that emerge from the unbound telesis of the identity M. These are the LU couplings that have actually emerged within the universe currently explored by the reality M. So we established a relationship between M and these LU couplings. These LU couplings within the syntactic metaverse, they are coupled to the identity to the extent that the identity generates these LU couplings, self-deploys within these LU couplings. Not only that, but M meta-subjectively distributes over this L, which then embeds this U. So the coupling is also a coupling of generation. And so this coupling of M with the LU couplings, it can again be mapped onto M because M will explain this coupling of M with these LU couplings. And it will explain it within what? not anything different, a meta-identity, it will still be M, because M is logically idempotent. So when you try to explain M, you use M. It has a self-actualization, self-potentialization, self-explanation. So it explains itself. When you want to understand how M explains anything in the universe, for example, of the LU couplings, or the relationship of this coupling with the global identity M, you still couple it to M, and M will provide the mapping, the coupling between the two. So it's this arbitrarily high order of metacognition of M. And without that, you would be stuck within a specific framework, and you would rob the ability of reality to understand itself. So M cannot be stuck even just with the M distributing over L. We have to conceive of this more general object, this M, which can logically apply to itself, and through idempotence just explain any level of theorization about itself. Any level of the theory of reality gets re-injected within this M that couples any components outlined in this theory of reality. And so the syntactic metaverse is not just this object that the universe has to carry this sort of irreducible explanation of there is a syntactic metaverse and we just explore it through the universe. You actually couple the syntactic metaverse with the identity itself, and you model the relationship of that with the identity at any level of explanation. And so M, or the CTMU, is this fixed point of explanation through which everything is modeled. Nothing is left out, and all the potential as well is modeled, because we're talking about the syntactic metaverse of all possible couplings. So all the potential is coupled, and all the integration of this potential within reality is also modeled by this same identity M.
Saying that M distributes over L amounts to saying that it distributes over points of L, i.e. syntactic operators and their coupled state transitional identification events, which are in turn locally embedded in M. The syntactic self-distribution of M involves self-similarity mapping, called d-endomorphism, in which M self-quantizes as triadic self-operators, acceptors and or generators, coinciding with relationships and identification events or measurements. Basically, this creates localized, attenuated copies of M immersed in a hological medium, everywhere identical to M. Capital D-endomorphism describes the past to future direction of time and the inward direction of space. The dual mapping evolution, or d-ectomorphism, has the opposite spatiotemporal directionality. These mappings occur only together in a spatiotemporally symmetric metaprocess called conspansion, where they define primary, potentiative, and secondary actualizative stages of causation, respectively associated with wave function propagation and collapse. This requires orthogonal, causal, and metacausal, mechanical, and telic modes of quantization associated with not only physical state and state transition, but adaptive syntax state, or medium content, relationships of arbitrary order.
So equation 6 says that M distributing over L retracts into M, but we want to give a little bit more texture about what does it mean that M distributes over L. And so we have to describe better what this meta-surjection of M into L quanta means. We have to describe better what this hological mapping means, this hological projection of M into the L quanta. And this will also speak to the kind of relationships that are being generated by M, which in turn utilize the property of M to couple to itself at arbitrarily high order of metacognition of itself, at arbitrarily high order of relationships. And this will also illustrate how the property that M couples to itself at arbitrarily high order of relationship also allows to tie together the reality under M because of the kind of relationships that are generated by M when it distributes over L. So what is this hological mapping of M onto the L quanta? So first of all, the L quanta are syntactic operators, and they are coupled to state transitional identification events all the way down to U, which are all embedded into M. They are locally embedded. There's this geometry of the events, this spatio-temporal geometry of the events that become locally embedded into M through the L quanta. And when we think of the distribution of M onto the L quanta, that's where we involve different kind of mapping which play different roles into the shaping of reality, into the evolution of reality. We want to explain the events. We also want to explain the process and this metaprocess of conspansion. So M has a self-similarity where the syntax, the descriptive syntax of M projects itself via lower d-endomorphism. So M itself is an operator that self-identifies through syntax and state, L and U, and the d-endomorphism carries by homology this structure to these syntactic operators. So the syntactic operators are triadic self-operators. They're both acceptors and or generators, which model the relationships and the events. So the relationships refer to some syntax that classifies, that structure the identification events, the measurements. And so the operators, they carry the state, the syntax, and the modeling, and they're coupling the two together. There are some specific coupling of language and universe that both accept some syntax, that will accept the laws of physics, they will accept whatever invariant is projected onto their operator type. They also generate, some of them will generate reality. So they will bind, they will access the unbound telesis and join some syntax and some state that will be compatible with the overall syntax of M, but that will generate from the local standpoint. There will be what M uses to generate, and through them, M will generate new syntax. M will factorize telesis through the syntactic operators, through localized version of itself. And so M, by self-similarity, projects this triadic nature of itself onto localized copy of itself, onto the L quanta. And so this L quanta inherit this object relation operation triality, this cognition model and universe triality. So the meta suggestion of M onto the L quanta is a self-similar syntactic self-distribution of M. This self-similar mapping creates localized version of M, an attenuated version of M, because the syntax of M, by the technical term of unisection, will cover all of the syntax within reality, because M is the coherent global identity of reality. And so all of the syntax of the syntactors come from M, are found in M. So M is not only this identity of reality, but when we look at the L quanta, it becomes this homological medium everywhere identical to M. So all of the local copies of M are immersed in this medium. And so there are attenuated versions of it that express some of the syntax and some of the states of this overall medium. The syntax of each of the local copies has to be supported by a global medium, which is carried by M. So M is this global medium. It's this sort of embedding in which we can think of these copies to exist. Each of the modeling of the state and the syntax exists where? In this medium of what? Of M. So that's what we can say for M. And this homology makes it so that the local syntax projects into the local copies by pure Mariology, by pure holographic projection of logic. So it's a pure surjection of M into these local copies. So these d-endomorphisms that preserve the syntax of M and project it onto local copies, they form this capital D endomorphism. So this capital D endomorphism describes the past to future direction of time, because M, the global syntax, reprojects itself into itself, so the inward direction of space. So M is this homological medium, and there's an evolution of M. There's a factorization of telesis through the medium of space-time. And when a new time is embedded within reality, the space endomorphically carries the full syntax of M within the copies of M, which means that a new state syntax of reality is created, a new space-time, which results from the endomorphism, the preserving structure of this d-endomorphism that reproduces all the structure that existed in the previous time in a previous state, just re-injected within itself while preserving the structure. And so the structure of M is always preserved from the past to future through this d-endomorphism. And the dual mapping of that is d d-endomorphism. So it's a dual evolution process, a dual mapping that has opposite spatial temporal directionality, meaning it goes from future to past, and it goes in the outward direction of space. And the homology of M is both of those. The mappings occur together in a spatial-temporally symmetric metaprocess called conspansion. So the idea is that the syntactor not only receives all of the structure of the past into itself through the d-endomorphism, but also will guide the future to past, so will guide the factorization of telesis from telons, telic goals that will orient the universe toward a future outcome and orchestrate some relationships within the universe so as to bring this future outcome into the network of what exists as the past. So there is the orchestration of these endomorphism so as to achieve the ectomorphism. You bring something new to the universe that is not contained in the endomorphism, which is not contained in the previous structure. And instead of just reproducing the structure inward in space, you generate a new path. You have the space going outwards. And so a syntactor that is localized will grow outward and it will interact with another syntactor. It will grow outward with the rate of conspansion of the speed of light. And once it has grown outward, there's an opportunity to redefine mappings with other syntactors and create this new opportunistic evolution of the universe that results from this outward space evolution. And these processes explore potential, and so it's from future to past. While the laws of physics and all of the invariants that come from the past and all the states and all the events from the past endomorphically reproduce their syntax within the L-quanta, the d-ectomorphism will generate new possibilities, will bind telesis so as to generate symmetrically this spatial-temporal evolution, which can be both past to future and future to past. And so it's a metaprocess called conspansion, where they defined primary potentiative and secondary actualizative stages of causation. So M is self-potentializing, self-actualizing. And so it involves a process, conspansion, that generate both of these stages within a metaprocess conspansion. And so this homology of M distributing over L is not a deterministic definition of L by M, hierarchical. It actually distributes this metaprocess where M potentializes through the L-quanta by distributing this metaprocess where they store both the evolution of the universe from past to future, but they also generate, they potentialize this future to past. They factorize telesis. And so there's potentiative process, which is described as this opposite spatial temporal directionality, this d-ectomorphism, where the reality opens up and potentializes itself. And the secondary actualizative stage is this d-endomorphism, where the universe reproduces itself, preserve the syntax, preserve the morphism. In mathematics, endomorphism means you preserve the algebraic structure within your mapping, and endomorphism even means that if you have a structure S with an algebra with syntax, then a morphism means that the structure will be preserved by the image of your process. Endomorphism means that the process will be included within the domain of your function. It's a morphism that stays inside of the domain of the process. And so in a similar way, the actualizative stage makes it so that the universe remaps itself into itself, preserving the structure. So that's the past to future. That's the incoversion, the capital D endomorphism. And the primary potentiative stage would be the inverse of the capital D endomorphism, so the D-1 morphism, the co-inversion, which expresses itself as this d-ectomorphism, this future to past, this outward direction of space. And so the endomorphism that could feel that the structure of the universe is just static and just rewrites within itself. So reality remains stable, remains the same everywhere, remains a stable logical medium because it remaps itself into itself. So that's the past to future, that's the endomorphism. But within this reality, there's also this potentiative process, this ectomorphism, which means mapping itself outside of itself, morphism keeping the same structure always. And so reality explores around itself and remaps whatever it has explored as actualization of it within itself. And so in all of these processes, you have the preservation of the structure of the universe, of the syntax of the universe, preservation of M, but you also have this expression of M, this creative, this generative aspect of M. M is a triadic self-operator that is both an acceptor and a generator. So that generates from the fundamental potentiative capacity of reality. And so this hology is really not something, it's not a process through time. It's a distribution of this metaprocess that distributes potentialization and actualization, that distributes wave function propagation and collapse, where the wave function propagation is this outward direction of space and collapse is this inward direction of space, this past to future. While the propagation is the future to past direction, because what will guide the collapse, it's a telic optimization. It's a telon, it's a higher order relation that will guide the collapse through a goal, through a telic relationship that will bring into the universe a factorization of telesis that satisfies a desirable outcome, an outcome that is in accord with the telic principle, with the self-goal that the universe assigned to itself, the self-utility of the system. And so these evolutions require orthogonal evolution, so metacausal telic evolution, on top of the traditional causal relationship that evolve and spread within reality. This mechanical causation as well, based on given certain states, you have certain outcomes that are expected, certain conservation of energy, certain laws that are expected as a mechanical causation. But these invariants that speak to a preservation of reality from past to future is complemented with metacausal process, with telic process that embed these generative processes as symmetric aspect of the accepting processes that just preserve the past events and the laws that are distributed onto reality, onto the past. And so orthogonal modes of quantization, which go beyond the state transition, the physical states, but instead have this generativity, this adaptive syntax state, medium content relationships of arbitrary order. So whenever we'll have to explain where a physical state comes from or where state transition comes from, where do laws of physics come from? Well, they come from this meta language of physics, from this meta coupling of language and universe that provides this ability to adapt state and syntax to distribute this meta process that close the meaning of the evolution, because there's these two complementary processes where potentiative phase defines the secondary stages. And so the distribution of M over L is really a distribution of potentiality, a self-similarity of some operator that is triadic itself, that will define a model of itself and syntax and state that satisfy this model or the goals of this model, this telic principle that define how the state and syntax will adapt to the evolving reality. And this mapping is also a hierarchy in the sense that M as a global reality, as the global hological medium, will have a primary potentiative phase that it will distribute to the rest of the local copies that we experience through the laws of physics, through the stable, single coherent history of the identification events that the syntactors can rely on to define their future states. The telic possibilities that are potentialized through the global universe and that allows the local copy, the syntactor, to optimize reality in accord with the telic potentiality of their own self-utility. So there is a sense where there's a hierarchy where M is the global identity and so defines the good, defines much of the states and state transition that is available for local copies to keep refining the universe with their attenuated copies. But the attenuated copies are what the identity M uses to locally refine the reality, to locally bind telesis, factorize telesis in state and syntax that become desirable through the local copies. And these local copies, by self-similarity, are involved with this meta process of potentiative stage of inner expansion and secondary stage of requantization. At the particle level, they're involved in these wave function propagations that become resources, potentiative resource that can collapse into specific events that can be orchestrated through specific relationships that tie together the collapse of wave functions in order to achieve something that is utile for the universe. So beyond the hierarchy by design self-distributes the evolution of the universe through the local copies. And so there is this image of M within the L quanta that provide the L quanta with responsibility within the universe, that provide the L quanta with function, with generation, not only observation of the identity of reality that is proposed by M, but also generation within this identity. And this spatial mapping that creates this link between the global and the local that remains a link that is open to potentialization and actualization is possible because of this meta-language, of this meta-causation, of this telic causation, because that's the structure of the mapping that is projected onto the elements. There is no deterministic determination from past to future. There's no fixed determination of syntax, but there is this unity, this coherence of M, and this existence of the local copies under the self-identity of the global identity of reality M, of the CTMU, where every element of this relationship express this metaprocess, this metacausation, and these orthogonal modes of quantization. This is what this triality in this meta-language allows us to model a theory where creation becomes distributed, where there is no fundamental constraint of the operator of the mind from the past, of the mind from the material. They emerge together in these meta processes, in this meta substance stasis that factorizes in state and syntax, that allows evolution, creation, experience of reality to be this distributed process with the foundation of the hological medium of the global identity of reality, but with the generation possibility, with the potentialization possibility that speaks to the observed freedom and the variability of the experience within reality that come from this explorative process of reality, from this explorative generation of reality that reflects onto the basic components of reality with wave function propagation and collapse, so with quantum mechanics, where quantum mechanics reflects a much broader process, a much broader structure of reality carried by the global identity of reality down to the syntactic operators, down to the L quanta, and that ultimately defines these relationships of higher order that are maintained onto the identification events of the universe, coupled together in a way that allows mechanical evolution as well as telic evolution, evolutive process, as well as meaning, as well as goals that are achieved by reality and by the local copies of M within reality.